The blazing Arizona sun had just begun its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and crimson when Madeline Sutton first spotted the lone rider. He slumped dangerously in his saddle, weaving an erratic path across the desert hardpan toward her isolated homestead outside Verde. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and despite every warning her father had drilled into her about desert strangers, Madeline grabbed her Winchester and raced toward the approaching figure. Arizona Territory, 1877. Life on the frontier had hardened Madeline in ways she'd never imagined when she'd left Philadelphia 3 years earlier. At 22, she'd traded silk dresses for leather boots, social gatherings for survival, all to fulfill her father's dream of finding silver in the unforgiving terrain. But since burying him last winter, the small cabin had become both sanctuary and prison. "Mister," Madeline called, rifle ready as the horse drew closer. "State your business." The rider didn't respond. Instead, he slipped sideways, tumbling from his saddle and hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, snorted nervously but stayed nearby, as loyal as any dog. Madeline approached cautiously. The man lay sprawled face down, his broad-shouldered frame motionless beneath a dust-covered duster coat. A weathered Stetson had fallen beside him, revealing thick dark hair streaked with desert grit. "Sir?" Madeline prodded his shoulder with her rifle barrel. When she rolled him over, she gasped. Despite the layer of trail dust, his face was striking, strong jaw covered in several days' stubble, high cheekbones, and features that might have been handsome if not contorted in pain. More alarming was the heat radiating from his skin when her hand accidentally brushed his face. "Water," he croaked, eyes fluttering open to reveal fever-bright hazel irises. "Please." Something about those eyes, their intensity even through obvious illness, made Madeline's decision for her. She couldn't leave him to die, not when she had the means to help. "I'm bringing you to my cabin," she said firmly. "Can you stand?" He tried and failed, collapsing back with a grunt of pain. Madeline sighed, looking between the man and her cabin 300 yards away. "Your horse will have to help," she decided. With considerable effort, she managed to get the semi-conscious man draped over his saddle. The stallion, sensing its master's distress, followed her docile command as she led it back to her cabin. Getting him inside was another matter entirely. Twice his weight, Madeline could barely maneuver him through the door and onto her father's bed. By the time she'd stripped off his duster, boots, and gun belt, sweat poured down her face despite the cooling evening air. His fever burned dangerously hot. Madeline worked methodically, undressing him down to his long underwear before fetching water from the well. She soaked cloths and placed them on his forehead, neck, and wrists, changing them repeatedly as they warmed from his skin. Night fell, and still, the stranger burned with fever. She found a bullet graze on his left arm, inflamed and angry. After cleaning it thoroughly with whiskey that made him groan even in delirium, she applied a poultice of the herbs her father had taught her to gather. "Easy now," she murmured when he thrashed against her ministrations. "You're safe here." Throughout the night, she kept vigil. His incoherent mutterings painted a disturbing picture, something about men chasing him, money that wasn't his, and a promise to someone named Samuel. Occasionally, he would grab her wrist with surprising strength, eyes wild but unseeing. "They're coming," he'd rasp before sinking back into fevered sleep. Dawn broke with little improvement. Madeline tended to her chores, feeding the chickens, milking her cow, and caring for the stranger's magnificent stallion before returning to his side. She spooned broth between his cracked lips, most of which dribbled down his chin, but some he swallowed reflexively. It was midday when he finally opened his eyes with something resembling clarity. "Where am I?" His voice was a dry crackle. "My homestead, outside Verde." Madeline held a cup of water to his lips. "You fell from your horse yesterday. Fever took you." He drank gratefully before asking, "Who are you?" "Madeline Sutton." "And you are?" Wariness flickered across his face. "Hayes, Holt Hayes." "Well, Mr. Hayes, you've been shot, though it's just a graze. The wound's infected, that's what's causing your fever." He attempted to sit up but fell back with a groan. "My horse," fed and watered, beautiful animal. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Samson, he's a good boy. Rest now, Madeline instructed. You're not going anywhere for a few days at least. Hayes's eyes had already begun to close, but he fought to keep them open. Not safe for you, he mumbled. Men following me, dangerous men. Rest, she repeated more firmly. I can handle myself. And she could. Madeline had been alone since her father's death, fending off everything from coyotes to the occasional prospector with designs on her land. The Winchester was an extension of her arm, and few men expected a woman who could drop a jackrabbit at 50 paces. But Hayes's warning troubled her. She checked that her rifle was loaded and kept it within arm's reach as she continued her chores. That evening, Hayes's fever spiked dangerously. Madeline stripped the sweat-soaked bedding and helped him into a fresh shirt she'd found in his saddlebags. He was burning up, muttering names and warnings. She dragged him to sit before the hearth, propping him against her shoulder as she bathed his face and neck with cool water. "I'll die here," he whispered suddenly, his voice clearer than it had been all day. "You will not," Madeline countered firmly, "not while I have anything to say about it." His feverish eyes met hers. "Why help a stranger?" Madeline considered her answer carefully. "Because out here, kindness is as rare as water. My father taught me never to waste either." Hayes seemed to accept this, his body sagging against hers as exhaustion overtook him again. The firelight painted shadows across his face, and Madeline found herself studying his features, the long lashes, the small scar bisecting one eyebrow, the firm line of his mouth. Despite his illness, there was strength in his face and something else. Sorrow, perhaps. Whatever drove this man, whatever demons chased him, had carved permanent lines around his eyes. "You need to rest," she told him, helping him back to the bed. "I'll keep watch tonight." He caught her wrist as she turned to go. "The fire," he rasped, his voice weak with fever. "Don't let it go out." "Sleep," she soothed. "I'll watch the fire." Something like gratitude flickered in his eyes before they closed. Madeline added logs to the hearth, settled into her father's old rocking chair, and kept her promise, watching over both the fire and the mysterious stranger who'd fallen into her life. The next day brought marginal improvement. Hayes could stay awake longer, take sips of broth and water without assistance, though sitting up remained a challenge. His fever persisted, but the dangerous spike had passed. Madeline redressed his wound, pleased to see the angry redness receding. "You have gentle hands," he observed, watching her work. Madeline felt her cheeks warm. "My father was prone to injuries. I had practice. Is he?" "Buried on the hill behind the cabin," she said tersely. "Since January." Hayes absorbed this. "You've been alone out here for 6 months." "I manage." She finished tying the bandage. "What about you? You mentioned someone named Samuel." His face clouded. "My brother, he's why I'm—" He stopped, seeming to think better of whatever he'd planned to say. "It's complicated." "Most things worth talking about are," Madeline replied, gathering her supplies. "Thank you," Hayes said suddenly, "for not leaving me to die out there." Madeline looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the weight behind his words. "You're welcome, Mr. Hayes. Just Hayes. Or Holt if you prefer. Mr. Hayes was my father, and I've spent most of my life trying not to be him." She nodded, understanding complicated relationships with fathers. "Holt, then. Most people call me Maddie." "Madeline suits you better," he said thoughtfully, "has a certain strength to it." It was the first time in years anyone had called her by her full name, with something approaching admiration rather than disapproval. In Philadelphia, she'd always been that Sutton girl who preferred books to balls, riding to needlepoint. The next few days established a routine. Madeline tended to her homestead in the mornings while Hayes slept. Afternoons were spent redressing his wound, helping him sit up longer, eventually moving to the table for meals. Evenings they passed by the fire, Hayes growing stronger each day, though the fever lingered. On the 4th night, as Madeline stoked the fire, Hayes finally shared his story. "I was a lawman once," he began, voice low. "Marshal in a small town in Colorado. Thought I was doing some good." Madeline settled in her chair, sensing this was important. "My brother Samuel was different. Restless, got mixed up with a gang led by a man named Jackson Blackstone, robbed banks, stage coaches." Hayes stared into the flames. I tried to talk sense into him, but Sam always had his own ideas about making a fortune quick. What happened? Madeline prompted when he fell silent. They robbed the wrong bank. The owner had connections with the territorial governor. A bounty went out dead or alive. I knew they'd kill Sam without blinking. Hayes's hands clenched. I tracked them, thinking I could get to him first, convince him to turn himself in. Did you? Hayes laughed bitterly. Found them holed up near the border. Sam was already dying shot by his own gang over some dispute about the money. He told me Blackstone had killed the others, was planning to keep everything himself. Madeline saw where this was heading. The money that isn't yours. Hayes nodded. Sam made me promise to take it, said Blackstone had killed a woman during the robbery, that he didn't deserve a cent, said I should use it to start over somewhere, honor his memory. His voice broke. He died in my arms, and I made a promise I had no business making. So you took the money. Blackstone returned while I was burying Sam. We exchanged shots. I winged him. He grazed me. I grabbed the satchel and ran. Hayes met her eyes. Now he's tracking me with 2 of his men. I've led them straight to your door, and for that I'm truly sorry. Madeline absorbed this. How much money are we talking about? $5,000. She whistled low. It was more money than she'd ever seen, enough to save her struggling homestead 10 times over. Where is it now? Samson's saddlebags have a false bottom, Hayes admitted. I should leave tomorrow. They can't be far behind. You can barely stand for 10 minutes, Madeline pointed out, and your fever hasn't broken completely. You leave now, you'll be dead within days. Better me than both of us. Madeline stood, hands on hips. I didn't nurse you this far to have you throw your life away. Besides, this is my home. I know every rock, every ridge for miles. If they come, we'll be ready. Hayes studied her with a mixture of admiration and concern. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolhardy. Probably both, she conceded with a small smile. Now rest. Tomorrow we'll prepare. That night, Hayes's fever finally broke. Madeline woke to find him drenched in sweat but cooler to the touch. His eyes, when they opened, were clear for the first time. You're going to live after all, Mr. Hayes, she said, relief washing through her. Seems that way, Miss Sutton, he replied, a genuine smile transforming his face. It struck her then how handsome he truly was when not contorted with fever. All thanks to you. The next morning, he insisted on getting up. Though still weak, Hayes moved around the cabin with determination, examining doors, windows, sightlines. Madeline showed him the root cellar beneath a trapdoor in the kitchen, a potential hiding place if needed. Your father chose well, Hayes noted, surveying the property. The cabin sat against a rocky outcropping that protected the rear with clear views of the approaches from 3 sides. Defensible. He wasn't always a silver seeker, Madeline explained, fought in the war. Said strategic positioning becomes second nature. Hayes nodded appreciatively, then hesitated. I should show you something. He led her to where Samson was corralled and retrieved the saddlebags. With practiced movements, he released a hidden catch, revealing a compartment containing several stacks of bills and a Colt Peacemaker that wasn't standard issue. Custom grip, he explained, seeing her interest in the weapon. More accurate than most, and the money. What will you do with it if you escape Blackstone? Hayes ran a hand through his hair. Honestly, I don't know. Can't keep it, not with how it was obtained. Can't return it without questions I can't answer. He looked at her directly. What would you do? Madeline considered. The bank owner, does he need it? Is he ruined without it? Franklin Carver. No, he owns half of Denver. Then perhaps it could do some good elsewhere. Madeline thought of the struggling families in Verdi, the drought that had devastated crops, the widow raising 5 children alone after her husband died in a mine collapse. There are people who truly need help. Hayes studied her thoughtfully. You've given this some consideration. When you have little, you think often about what you would do with more, she said simply. Something changed in Hayes's expression, respect mingled with something warmer. Before he could respond, Samson nickered nervously. Both turned to see a dust cloud in the distance. Riders, Hayes said grimly, 3 of them. Madeline's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. How do you want to play this? We could run. This is my home, she cut him off. I'm not abandoning it, Hayes nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. Then we prepare. Over the next hour, they transformed the cabin into a fortress. Hayes, despite his weakened state, moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. Madeline followed his instructions, positioning furniture for cover, preparing ammunition, filling water buckets in case of fire. Take this, Hayes said, pressing the custom Colt into her hands. It's lighter than your Winchester for close quarters. I prefer my own, she replied, but tucked the gun into her belt anyway. As the riders drew closer, Hayes made a decision. Let me talk to them first, if it goes badly. He looked at her intensely. Promise you'll use that cellar if needed, live to fight another day. Madeline met his gaze steadily. Only if you promise the same. Hayes smiled faintly. Deal. They positioned themselves, Hayes on the porch, still looking unwell enough to be convincing, but with his gun hidden within easy reach. Madeline inside, Winchester ready at a window with a clear shot. The riders approached slowly, deliberately. In the lead was a man with a distinctive scar running from temple to jaw, his right arm in a crude sling. Jackson Blackstone, Madeline presumed. The other two flanked him, hardened men with cold eyes and hands hovering near holstered weapons. Hayes, Blackstone called, stopping 30 yards out. Thought that fever might have done our job for us. Sorry to disappoint, Hayes replied, leaning against the porch post as if still weak. Long ride for nothing, Blackstone. Not for nothing. Blackstone's eyes narrowed. You have something that belongs to me. Stolen money belongs to the bank, not the thief, Blackstone spat. Spare me your moralizing. Your brother was just as guilty. Leave Sam out of this, Hayes warned, his casual posture belying the tension in his voice. Touching. Blackstone surveyed the cabin. Found yourself a nursemaid, I see. Hope she knows what kind of snake she's taken in. Hayes straightened slightly. She's not involved. This is between us. She's involved the moment she harbored you, Blackstone countered, but I'm reasonable. Give me the money and we'll leave you both to whatever pathetic life you're building here. Madeline watched Hayes's shoulders tense, knew he was weighing options, calculating odds, 3 against 1 against 2 if she counted herself, though Hayes might not. The money's gone, Hayes said finally. I sent it back to Carver, anonymous delivery. Blackstone's laugh was ugly. You expect me to believe that you, the righteous lawman, had $5,000 in your possession for weeks and just gave it back? He shook his head. You have until sundown to produce my money, or we burn this place to the ground with both of you in it. With that, Blackstone wheeled his horse around. The 3 riders retreated to a stand of trees visible on the horizon, close enough to watch, far enough to be safe from rifle fire. Hayes came inside, face grim. They'll wait until dark, then come from multiple directions. You don't look surprised, Madeline observed. Men like Blackstone are predictable. Money and revenge, that's all he wants. Hayes checked his gun. I'm sorry I've brought this to your door. Madeline looked around the cabin, her home, sparse but entirely hers, everything she and her father had worked for. What's your plan? Hayes glanced at her, surprised. You're still with me in this? Unless you have another nursemaid lined up, she replied dryly. For the first time since his fever broke, Hayes laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face. Madeline Sutton, you are remarkable. She felt warmth creep into her cheeks. The plan, Hayes sobered. They'll expect us to stay inside, defend from the cabin. It's what most people would do. But not us, she guessed. Not us, he confirmed. I'm thinking we use the remaining daylight to set a trap of our own. As the sun began its westward descent, they worked quickly. Hayes, though not fully recovered, moved with renewed purpose. They dug shallow pits covered with brush at likely approach points. Madeline showed him the creek bed that ran behind the property, dry now in summer, but offering a covered approach. My father used to say knowledge of terrain beats firepower every time, she explained, helping Hayes over a rocky section. Smart man, Hayes replied, studying the landscape with a tactician's eye. When they returned to the cabin, daylight was fading. Hayes insisted on one more precaution, hiding the money. Not in the cabin, he decided. Too obvious. Madeline considered, then led him to the chicken coop. No one looks too closely at chicken droppings, she said, removing a loose board in the floor. Hayes handed her the money with a half-smile. Your father raised a clever daughter. He tried, she said softly. As darkness fell, they finalized their plan. Instead of waiting in the cabin as Blackstone expected, they would position themselves outside Hayes in the root cellar with its external access point. Madeline in the small tool shed that offered a clear view of the cabin's front. If anything happens to me, Hayes said as they prepared to take their positions, the money's yours. Use it however you see fit. Nothing's happening to either of us, Madeline replied firmly, but thank you. Their eyes met in the dim light of the single lantern they'd left burning. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the danger, yes, but something more. A connection formed through fever dreams and fireside confessions, through the intimate act of one person saving another's life. Hayes reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek with unexpected tenderness. Be careful, you too, she whispered. They moved to their positions as full darkness descended. Madeline settled in the tool shed, Winchester ready, Hayes's Colt tucked in her belt. Through a gap in the planks, she watched the cabin, its single lantern casting a warm glow through the windows, an invitation to those who would do them harm. An hour passed. Then another. The night creatures fell silent, warning of approaching danger before Madeline saw anything. Then, shadows moved against shadows, 3 figures approaching from different directions. Blackstone took the direct route while his men circled to the sides. Madeline steadied her breathing, waiting for Hayes's signal, a double owl hoot that would sound natural to anyone unfamiliar with the desert. These men were from Colorado. They wouldn't know that barn owls rarely called in pairs. The men drew closer. One stepped into a shallow pit, cursing as he stumbled. The other approached the side window, peering in. Blackstone crept toward the front door, gun drawn, then the signal. 2 soft hoots carried on the night air. Madeline raised her rifle and fired at the man by the window. He dropped with a cry of surprise, more than pain. She'd aimed for his shoulder, unwilling to kill if she could avoid it. Hayes emerged from his hiding place, gun trained on the second man who was struggling to free his boot from the pit trap. Drop it, Hayes commanded, or the next one's in your head. The man hesitated, then let his gun fall. But Blackstone had already ducked around the cabin's corner, using the confusion to disappear from view. Inside, Hayes shouted to Madeline. He's circling around. Madeline abandoned her position, racing for the cabin. She reached the porch just as Blackstone emerged from the shadows behind her. A shot rang out, Hayes firing a warning, but Blackstone was already on her, one arm around her throat, gun to her temple. Drop your weapon, Hayes, Blackstone shouted, or she dies right now. Madeline felt the cold press of steel against her skin, but refused to show fear. She caught Hayes's eye and gave an imperceptible nod. Hayes lowered his gun slowly. Let her go, Blackstone. This is between us. Where's my money? Blackstone snarled, tightening his grip. Inside, Hayes lied smoothly. Hidden under the floorboards, I'll show you. Blackstone laughed harshly. You must think I'm a fool. She'll show me. You stay right there. He backed toward the door, dragging Madeline with him. One wrong move, and I paint this porch with her brains. Hayes remained still, hands raised, but his eyes never left Madeline's. She read the message in them. Wait for your moment. Inside the cabin, Blackstone shoved her forward. Where is it? And don't try anything stupid. Madeline stumbled deliberately, buying seconds to think. Her Winchester was gone, dropped outside, but Hayes's Colt remained tucked at the small of her back, hidden by her shawl. Under the bed, she improvised. The loose board is hard to find in the dark. I need a light. Blackstone reached for the lantern with his injured arm, keeping his gun trained on her. The moment his attention split, Madeline drew the Colt and fired. The shot went wide. She wasn't accustomed to the lighter pull, but it was enough to startle Blackstone. He fired back, the bullet splintering the bedpost as Madeline dived for cover. She rolled beneath the table as the door burst open, Hayes charging in with his reclaimed weapon. 2 more shots exploded in the confined space. Madeline heard a grunt of pain but couldn't tell who was hit. She scrambled for position, raising the Colt again as Hayes and Blackstone grappled near the fireplace. Blackstone was stronger, his fury giving him advantage over Hayes's still recovering body. He slammed Hayes against the wall, gun raised for a killing blow. Madeline didn't hesitate, she fired. This time her aim was true. Blackstone staggered, looking down at the spreading crimson stain on his chest with almost comical surprise. He turned toward Madeline, raising his gun with trembling hands, but Hayes delivered a final blow that sent him crashing to the floor. Silence descended, broken only by their ragged breathing. Hayes crossed to Madeline, helping her to her feet. "Are you hit?" he asked urgently, hands checking her for injuries. "No," she managed. "You?" "Just reopened my old wound," he grimaced, pressing a hand to his side where fresh blood seeped through his shirt. "What about the other two?" "One's wounded, the other trapped," she remembered. "We should check them?" The aftermath was messy but conclusive. Blackstone was dead. One of his men had a shattered shoulder but would live. The other had twisted his ankle in the pit trap. Hayes bound them both securely while Madeline tended his reopened wound. "What do we do with them?" she asked, nodding toward the surviving outlaws. Hayes considered. "The sheriff in Verde is a fair man. We'll deliver them and most of the money to him. Tell him it was recovered from Blackstone after he attacked us." "Most of the money?" Madeline raised an eyebrow. Hayes met her gaze steadily. "I seem to recall a widow with 5 children who could use a fresh start." Madeline's lips curved into a small smile. "And what about you? Where will you go after?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Hayes looked around the cabin, then back at her. "I haven't had a home in a long time," he said quietly. "Might be nice to stop running. This place is too big for one person," Madeline heard herself saying. "Always has been." Hayes stepped closer, his hand finding hers. "Are you offering me a job, Miss Sutton?" "I'm offering you a choice, Mr. Hayes." Their eyes held, the connection between them deepening, solidifying into something neither had expected when he'd fallen from his horse days earlier. The ride to Verde the next day was tense but uneventful. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Thompson, listened to their story with growing interest, especially when Hayes revealed his former occupation as a marshal. "Heard about that bank job," Thompson said, examining the recovered money. "Word was the whole gang died in the attempt." "Not all of them," Hayes replied, "but they have now." Thompson studied him thoughtfully. "Territory could use more good lawmen. Position of deputies been open since Miller took a bullet last month." Hayes glanced at Madeline, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I might be interested," he told Thompson, "but I have commitments outside town." "Place is only half a day's ride," Thompson shrugged. "Many deputies keep a foot in both worlds." As they left the sheriff's office, Madeline turned to Hayes. "A lawman again, maybe." His hand found the small of her back naturally, as if it belonged there. "If certain commitments don't object," she smiled. "I think those commitments find the idea rather agreeable." The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. Hayes divided his time between deputy duties in Verde and helping Madeline with the homestead. His strength returned fully, and with it came plans improvements to the cabin, expanding the garden, repairing the barn roof before winter. They worked side by side, their partnership evolving from necessity to choice. Evenings found them by the fire, talking late into the night. Hayes spoke of his childhood in Ohio, his father's strict upbringing, his decision to seek justice rather than fortune. Madeline shared stories of Philadelphia society, her mother's early death, her father's dreams that had become her own. "Do you miss it?" Hayes asked one night. "The city, the conveniences," Madeline considered. "Sometimes, but I've found something better here." "A struggling homestead and a reformed lawman." His tone was light, but his eyes searched hers. "Freedom," she replied, "and purpose." She hesitated, then added softly, "and companionship I never expected." Hayes's hand covered hers. Neither spoke for a long moment, the crackling fire filling the silence. "Madeline," he finally said, "I'm not a man of many words, but I need you to know what started as gratitude has become something more, something I never thought I'd find again after losing everything." Her heart quickened. "And what is that, Holt Hayes?" "Hope," he said simply, A future, a reason to stay in one place. His fingers tightened around hers. If you'll have me. Madeline turned her hand to intertwine their fingers. I nursed you back from the brink of death, Mr. Hayes. I'm not letting you go that easily. His smile transformed his face, erasing the hardness that life had carved there. Is that a yes? Instead of answering, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with months of unspoken longing. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. That, Madeline said, is a definite yes. 2 weeks later, they stood before the minister in Verdi's small church. Madeline wore her mother's lace collar over her best dress. Hayes wore a new shirt and his deputy's badge. Sheriff Thompson stood as witness, along with the widow Caraway and her children, recipients of an anonymous gift that had saved their farm. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister declared. You may kiss your bride. Hayes's kiss was a promise of protection, of partnership, of a love neither had been looking for but both had found in the most unlikely circumstances. That night, in their cabin now truly theirs together, Hayes built the fire higher than usual. Madeline watched him, remembering those first fevered days when she'd kept the flames burning to fight off death. What are you thinking about? He asked, catching her distant expression. How differently this could have ended, she admitted. If you'd ridden past our homestead, if your fever had won. Hayes crossed to her, taking her hands in his. I believe some things are meant to be, fever or no fever. He brushed a kiss across her knuckles. Though I'm grateful for your stubbornness in keeping me alive. Madeline laughed. Stubbornness is a Sutton family trait, I'm afraid. Hayes' family trait now, he corrected with a smile that reached his eyes. Later, as moonlight streamed through the window, Madeline curled against her husband's side, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. So different from the erratic, fever-weakened pulse she'd monitored those first nights. Tell me something true, she whispered, an intimate game they'd begun during his recovery. Hayes's fingers trailed along her arm. I've never believed in fate, he said thoughtfully. Always thought life was what you made it, good or bad. But then I rode half dead across the desert and found exactly what I didn't know I needed. His arms tightened around her. That seems like more than chance. My father would say it was divine providence, Madeline murmured. What do you say? She propped herself up to look into his eyes. I say some fires are worth keeping watch over, no matter how dark the night. His answering kiss was all the confirmation she needed. Spring arrived with new beginnings. Hayes had proven himself an exemplary deputy, respected in Verdi for his fairness and courage. Madeline had expanded their garden, trading vegetables in town for goods they couldn't produce. The homestead flourished under their combined efforts, and plans for additional buildings took shape as their success grew. But the greatest joy came with Madeline's whispered news one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Holt, she said, taking his hand and placing it over her still flat stomach. We'll need to add another room by winter. His expression shifted from confusion to wonder. You're certain? She nodded, happiness radiating from her face. The doctor confirmed it yesterday. Hayes gathered her into his arms, emotion overwhelming words. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with feeling. I never thought I'd have this a family of my own. Believe it, she said, kissing him softly. This child will have your strength, and heaven help us, my stubbornness. A formidable combination, he laughed. That night, as Madeline slept peacefully beside him, Hayes watched the fire burning low in the hearth. He thought of the twisting path that had brought him here, the loss, the guilt, the fever that had nearly claimed his life. How strange that his darkest moment had led him to this light. 7 months later, William James Hayes entered the world on a crisp December morning, his lusty cries filling the cabin as dawn broke over the desert. The midwife from town pronounced him perfect, with his father's eyes and his mother's determination. Hayes held his son with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the tiny life they'd created. Hello, William, he whispered. Welcome home. Madeline watched them from the bed, exhausted but radiant. He likes you, she observed as the baby quieted in his father's arms. Smart boy, Hayes replied, carefully returning their son to her. Taking after his mother already. The following years brought changes both expected and surprising. A second child, Elizabeth Rose, joined their family 18 months after William. Hayes was promoted to sheriff when Thompson retired, allowing him to spend more time closer to home. Madeline started a small school for the growing number of children in the area, using her Philadelphia education to benefit their community. The homestead expanded to include a proper barn, additional rooms for their growing family, and eventually, a separate schoolhouse where Madeline taught 3 days a week. They planted fruit trees that finally bore after years of careful tending, a metaphor Hayes often thought for the life they'd built together. On their 5th anniversary, Hayes surprised Madeline with a trip back east, her first return to Philadelphia since leaving with her father. They stayed with distant cousins who marveled at the transformation of the restless girl they remembered into a confident woman with a handsome husband and 2 beautiful children. "Are you glad you came back?" Hayes asked as they walked along streets that must have once been so familiar to her. Madeline considered the elegant houses, the carefully manicured gardens, the women in their elaborate dresses. "It's like visiting a dream," she said finally. "Familiar but not quite real anymore." Hayes understood. "And Verdi, our homestead?" She smiled up at him, certainty in her eyes. "That's real, that's home." Later that night, after the children were asleep in their borrowed beds, Hayes presented her with a small package wrapped in plain paper. "What's this?" Madeline asked, fingers tracing the simple twine bow. "Open it and see." Inside was a delicate silver locket. When opened, it revealed a tiny painting of their cabin on one side and their children on the other. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tears threatening. "But what's the occasion?" Hayes took her hands in his. "5 years ago, you saved my life. Not just by nursing me through fever, but by giving me something to live for." He kissed her softly. "Every day since has been a gift I never expected." Madeline touched his face, tracing the lines that had deepened with time and smile rather than hardship. "We saved each other, I think." The truth of this statement had never been more clear than when they returned home to Verdi. The sight of their cabin's smoke curling from the chimney where their neighbor had laid a fire in anticipation of their return filled both with profound contentment. William and Elizabeth raced inside, exclaiming over small changes as if they'd been gone years instead of weeks. Hayes carried their bags while Madeline checked that all was well with their small flock of chickens and the vegetable garden. That evening, with the children finally asleep after their excitement, Madeline and Hayes sat before the fire, just as they had on so many nights before. His arm around her shoulders, her head resting in the familiar hollow of his neck. "Tell me something true," she requested, continuing their long-standing tradition. Hayes considered, watching the flames dance. "I believe the best decision I ever made was to keep riding that day, even as fever took me. Something instinct, providence, stubborn will told me to push forward instead of making camp." He kissed the top of her head. "It led me to you. And the worst fever of your life," she reminded him with a smile. "A small price to pay," he murmured against her hair. Outside, the desert wind swept across the land they'd tamed together. Inside, the fire burned steady and bright, a beacon of the home they'd created, the love they'd found, the life that had begun with a chance encounter on the Arizona frontier. The fever that had once threatened to take Holt Hayes' life had instead given him everything worth living for. 15 years later, the homestead had grown into a prosperous ranch. William, now 20, had his father's quiet strength and his mother's thoughtful nature. Elizabeth, 18, combined beauty and intelligence with a fierce independence that sometimes left her parents breathless. And 10-year-old Samuel, their surprise blessing, had his namesake uncle's restless spirit, but tempered with his father's moral compass. Hayes, silver now threading his dark hair, still served as sheriff, though he'd begun training his eventual replacement. Madeline divided her time between the ranch, the now proper school she'd founded, and various community initiatives that had transformed Verdi from a struggling outpost to a thriving town. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I died of that fever," Hayes mused one evening as they sat on their expanded porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson. "You didn't," Madeline replied simply, her hand finding his with the ease of decades together. "That's what matters." Hayes turned to study his wife's face, still beautiful to him, the lines around her eyes and mouth only enhancing the character he'd fallen in love with. "Tell me something true," he requested, reversing their old game. Madeline smiled, considering her answer as she gazed out at the land they'd nurtured together. "I never regretted a single moment," she said finally. "Not the hard winters, not the droughts, not even those first terrifying days when I thought you might die and leave me alone with the consequences of helping a stranger." She met his eyes, the love of a lifetime reflected there. "Every choice led us here, and here is exactly where we're meant to be." Hayes leaned over to kiss her, a gesture as natural as breathing after all their years together. "Here," he agreed, "is home." Inside their ranch house, a fire burned steadily in the hearth, no longer needed for survival, but kept alive as a reminder of beginnings, of promises kept, of a love that had started with fever and faith and flourished against all odds in the wild, beautiful wilderness they'd made their own.